not need to confirm on your end. So today with our AMPlify series, again, the point of this series is to offer different sessions on various elements that we can all use to support our careers. And it stems from our desire in AMPS to support early career researchers. So Dr. Melissa Forbes is our current ECR chair and has put together a wonderful suite of sessions this year that are different from last year, which is really exciting. We do record the sessions and share them via our YouTube channel and our AMPS website as well. I would also like to take a moment to recognize that we are on all different lands. So for me, that's the Wolguru Kaba land up here in Townsville, but I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging wherever in the world we are sitting. Without further ado, I'm super excited that we have with us Kate Stevens today. Professor Kate Stevens is one of the founding members of AMPS, which is exciting to have her still be, involved on the committee with us as well. But she's wearing her editor hat today as she is editor-in-chief of Music Perception. And so I'm very excited for her to talk about the publishing process. And Kate mentioned earlier, she is happy to take questions along the way. So please feel free to speak up, raise your hand. I can also man the chat as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kate. Thanks so much, Kate.
Amanda, thank you. Really lovely to be here and appreciated the invitation. Hope everyone is hearing me okay. Looks as if you are. Good. And yeah, it's delightful to join this great program. Well done, Amanda, and to your team. I just think it's been fantastic to see these AMPlify sessions unfold. So congratulations. My name is Kate Stevens, and I would like to begin, as Amanda did, acknowledging the traditional custodians of country on which we are meeting. I am on, and I acknowledge Darug country, and I acknowledge the Barramatigal people of the Darug Nation. I extend my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course to Aboriginal First Nations people online today, and of course around the world. In fact, we do quite a bit of work on speech and language processing in the institute that I lead here at Western Sydney University, and I've learned from two of our students, from Jasmine and Corinna, a little bit of Darug language. So I say Warrami, and just acknowledging their fantastic work with the Darug, proud Darug women themselves, and acknowledging the teaching and learning that's been happening on these lands for thousands and thousands of years. So Amanda mentioned my hobby, which is editor of Music Perception, a job that I absolutely love, I have to say. And if there's time at the end, I might convey to you why I love it so much, in case you're interested. I'd even say to you, ask your senior colleagues and collaborators, ask them, why do they review? Why are they associate or action editors on journals? You might be surprised by the answers. What I'm hoping to do today is to demystify some of the process. I'm assuming that we've got mixed levels of experience online. I suspect you're postdoctoral research fellows or graduate students, but I'm very interested in hearing your suggestions and comments, and certainly from colleagues, not only students and postdocs, but in other more senior colleagues. Amanda, you might like to share some experiences and comments as well. Have you had a good experiences? I should ask that first up. Is this group therapy today? Has anyone had a good experience in this process, or are we all just going to have a bit of a communal hug? People are laughing. Yeah, mixed experiences. Marjorie, you look like you've had you've come through the other side. Matthew's doing this. Okay, Matthew, Marjorie, you've had a little bit of a journey. Okay, and we all have, folks, me included, right? But as I say, I will talk a little bit later about why I just love the editing process, and I hope taking a bit of the mystery away gives you some confidence today. I'll share a couple of slides here and just give you a sense of how I thought I'd approach this, but I'm always interested in hearing from you if you've got particular questions or, you know, things that are on your mind today. It's just really helpful for me if you want to pipe up and mention them now, or if you want to pop them in the chat, it at least means I know what you're thinking about, and I can try and make sure I touch on it, or, you know, pivot a little, as they say, if we need to go off in a direction that you're wanting to hear about. So don't feel shy in jumping in with suggestions, comments, experiences, and also questions that you have to make sure we make this really relevant for you today. Okay, so I am a casual kind of gal. I'll go through some slides, but I will be asking you to comment and make suggestions at any point along the way, noting, as Amanda has said, that we are recording. Okay, so I'm here because of my role with music perception and some scars and bruises along the way as an author myself over many years. What was that description of that first manuscript I submitted? It was something like, oh, I should remember that. Oh, I've repressed it. It was such a bad experience, unwieldy, you know, inelegant. Yes, they were not kind words. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just how we are trying to have really respectful language and positive tone in our reviews. I think there were some pretty tough days in the past, but let's keep the respect uppermost as we all review and engage in publishing along the way. So this is what I thought I'd touch on. Just a couple of minutes on trends in publishing, academic publishing. You're probably very aware of this, but I'll just mention a couple of things and then get to the really meaty part of the conversation today about when do you select a journal and how do you do that? Interested in your thoughts about that. Just some steps in the process. Again, if you've been through it, you know the steps, but I'll share them and round things off with just a summary of some challenges I see and I know other editors see, and hopefully you'll have questions along the way, and maybe you'll have some top tips that you'll be taking away from this. So we might share some of those as we get through the session. Okay, so I'm just going to look. I can't see you now that I've shared my screen, but put your hand up or pop Q in the chat or put some words in the chat and I'll make sure I respond. Okay, Amanda, we good to go?
Yep, Kate, we're good.
All clear. Okay, so let's push on. So what's happening in the academic publishing world? Well, I think across the societies and the conferences that we are members of and the conferences that we attend, you'll have a real sense, not only in music psychology, but in many, many fields of academic inquiry, that there has been enough colonisation and colonial work undertaken over these centuries. And so it's all of our responsibility to be really thinking about equity and inclusion, representativeness, and this is with reference to the topics that we're studying, the way we're sampling from populations, the boards that make up our scholarly journals, the reviewing that we do, and even as far as the teams of research collaborators and authors. So equity and inclusion, representativeness, and I suppose there's been a range of reasons at a social and political level for these very important matters to come through. Way too late, I would suggest, but it's really important that we are aware of them at all levels of academic kind of employment and study. I think the other theme that's really coming through is this notion of respectful practices. And I just pull this from the Society for Music Theory, but one hopes, and I believe it is the case, that most journals, and particularly journals in our humanities, arts and social sciences kind of areas, such as music, are really wanting to emphasise respectful, constructive, expert and timely reviews. So we had a joke there at the beginning about have you had some bruises and scars? We are trained to critique. Reviewers are there to critique and to comment. Critical commentary, even when critiquing and pointing out some questions and issues, can still have a positive feel to it. And certainly the tone needs to be civil and not condescending, sarcastic, pejorative, or bullying. So just be aware that many of the journals and conferences are really trying to make sure that we uphold those principles. And I certainly keep an eye on reviews as they come in, and really ask reviewers to address any tone that is not upholding that kind of respectful practice. Open science, you'll be very familiar with Open Science Framework. Google it if you're not aware of it, but I'm sure you are. This whole push towards sharing our data, the reanalysis of data sets, the replication that is now called for, and in fact journals are welcoming the publication and the submission of replications. So that has certainly changed since I was a student. Pre-registration, and really try to have the greatest integrity in our research and in our science. So we are pre-registering and really making sure that we are not hypothesizing after results are known. So Open Science Framework will give you some pointers there. With COVID, of course, we've seen a whole lot of moves towards online data collection. That brings its own challenges, particularly when you're working with auditory stimuli. And I see that as editor, with manuscripts coming in with hundreds and hundreds of participants in the sample. Always important to ask a question about the quality of the audio, and of course just the vigilance of participants when you're not necessarily there present with them as the data is being collected. So that's obviously a trend that I'm sure you're aware of as well. The statistical analyses, again, since I was a student, there have been moves away from some of the more traditional inferential approaches to statistically analysing quantitative data. There's always been debates and schools of thought about the best way to do some of that work, but we see an increasing use of linear mixed effects models and more probabilistic and Bayesian approaches. And many journals will have policies and guidelines about this. So you would be looking at those as you're selecting your journal and as you're thinking about the analyses that you're going to apply to your data. Predatory journals, I think, have been a hot topic for a long time. They are beastly things. Beale's list is now quite old, but it's sobering to look at that list. It's not necessarily being updated, but I guess one of the rules of thumb as we demystify today and as we share some practices and tips, talk to more experienced colleagues, your peers, your more senior student peers, your postdoctoral peers, and of course people that have been publishing in academic journals for a long time. Make sure the journal that's sent you that really lovely email is real, and do the due diligence on journals to make sure you're sending your work to a reputable place. These places do exist still, and it's not always that obvious. And the other, I guess, point that is really coming through loud and clear at the moment, you'd be aware of this, just the cost. Fabulous to have open access opportunities in some journals. You generally need to pay for that open access privilege, and those fees are quite significant. So that's a conversation to have about the pros and cons of open access fees. Not all journals are entirely open access. It's most often you will be taking that path if you can afford the fees to make your article freely available. And of course, then it means it's not behind a paywall and everyone can access it. But of course, you're paying that, or your grant is paying, or your department is paying. The other aspect that comes with that is the rights you have as an author to archive your work. So many people will have websites. Your university probably has a repository. Academia, ResearchGate, all of these places will be pulling from journals your work. You may well be uploading things yourself. Be aware of the policy attached to the particular journal that you're publishing in. And I use this site a lot. It's called Sherpa Romeo. It looks a little bit different now, but I've just pulled it up for music perception. And it gives you the kinds of policies. Can I put it on my homepage? Can I share the PDF? Can I put it into my university's repository? You get all of that information from Sherpa Romeo by just putting in the journal name. Now, music perception is an interesting one because, well, of course it is. I would say that. I'm biased. But it is published by a university press. It is not an open access journal. It does not have the funding of a publishing house like Sage or Elsevier and some of the other publishing houses. So it's still a subscription model, meaning that libraries subscribe to this journal, and that means the articles are often behind a paywall, but you don't pay a cent to publish in Music Perception, and the publisher, the university publisher, allows you to make it freely available. So it's not an open access journal. It doesn't have an open access pathway. It doesn't cost you anything, and you have the right to post the PDF. But it means it's a more modest publishing house because it's a university not-for-profit publisher, whereas most of those other big publishers, of course, are commercial, and they are making dollars. They have shareholders, and they are making money out of your work and the work of reviewers and editors that are very often doing work for free. Okay, so quite a few words there just on trends in publishing. Can I just stop and ask if there's any questions? Please put up your little hand if you've got a question, or put a Q in the chat. And I'll share the slides, Amanda, and obviously the recording will come through as well. Okay, what do you think? Over to you. What do you think is the right time to select a journal to publish or to send your manuscript to? Any ideas on when you would think about the journal outlet? Anyone game enough to say something? No one's going to fess up. Amanda, I'll put you on in the hot seat there. When do you think about where to send your manuscript, Amanda?
I've done it multiple ways because I think I've done a few projects that then become massive and have to think about pieces. But what I'm trying to do with students now is from the beginning, thinking about the project aims and who's going to be interested in these types of findings. I'm trying to think through a list, like a sort of a short list of options, sort of from the beginning to keep in mind.
Will you be my supervisor? That's great advice. Fabulous advice, and great suggestions coming in the chat. Yeah, let's do it early. Let's be thinking about it early. And I have to say, in my editor role, I think I see a lot of manuscripts that haven't really thought about music perception and until perhaps they've been rejected from elsewhere, or they've just not given it any thought, and they think their work is about perception, so they send it off to music perception without any thought of the audience or whether it fits with the journal's aims and scope. So as early as possible, Scott, that's great. Think about it as you're beginning writing. Nicola, exactly right. Sonia, while writing, definitely. All good answers. And Amanda's also given us the opportunity there of it depends. You know, it depends. I knew a very senior colleague who used to say he was thinking about the journal that he would be sending his studies to as he was writing the grant application. Because he was thinking about the grant application, although it was written as a pitch and in slightly different ways, he was thinking right back at that time about where to send the work, who the audience would be, who he wanted to tell. And he would even use, of course, probably some text from that grant application in one of those journal articles. So as early as possible, knowing that things change, opportunities change, and Amanda's also given you a great tip there. Have your shortlist, you know, have nature at the top, or what, you know, cognition or psychological review, you know, whatever your holy grail is for publishing your work, have it at the top for sure, and then have your alternatives underneath that, and be ready to send it off again when it bounces back from one of those journals where the acceptance rate might be 5%. Okay, but aim high and have that short list. But you're probably thinking already about, is it a mainstream kind of paper or is it a more specialist one? Those journals I mentioned, very general, aren't they? Psychological Review, Cognition, compared with some of the more specialist ones that I'm going to touch on, including music perception. Okay, so starting early is great. Any other suggestions on when? And then we'll go to how to select a journal. Let's see what we said here. So I would say while writing is good, before writing the manuscript makes sense, because you're thinking about who you want to tell, you know, who the audience is that you're really wanting to communicate. Point two I thought of today as I was writing these slides, but, you know, there are probably some fantastic supervisors like Amanda who make a publication plan as part of the research and thesis planning. You know, I don't know that I did that as a student, but I've probably encouraged students to do it. So think about it, you know, how many papers are we expecting? And think about it right back at the point of writing your confirmation of candidature or whatever early writing you're doing. When writing a grant application, and the theme that I hope you're getting here is, please don't be an island with this stuff. There's such expertise on this group and amongst your peers and with your supervisors. So it's really important to be discussing all of these all the way along. What about how to select a journal? We've touched on that already. What do you think? Any suggestions on how to select where to send it? Matthew, you had a bad experience. I hope it's improved. Do you have any ideas? Do you have any suggestions on, you know, how to select the journal?
Oh, no, I had good experience and a bad experience. I think, well, actually, I have a question. I wonder if, can I ask a quick question? Okay, so just regarding that, what I wanted to, I guess I had a situation where I got a rejection, and I wrote under the advice of my supervisor at the time. Actually, I wrote an email to the editor of the journal, and the editor replied but asked me for more details about. I guess I was wanting to know about, like, what should I do? You know, should I rewrite the article and resubmit it, that kind of thing? But the editors also then didn't get back to me. So I would be interested in your thoughts as an editor, and how much can an author be kind of asking and pushing and kind of, well, no, I thought that I might be pushing if I kept on at the editor about, you know, what can I do? Or, you know, because I know they're busy. Yeah, right, you're busy. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, Matthew. So I try and, it will really come down to the editor and their time. Again, I think your supervisors and your peers, you know, your supervisory panel is really important to be guiding you in this. And even if you've gone beyond having a supervisor, you know, have a team of collaborators that you connect with to have these conversations, because they should be able to give you as much as advice as the editor. I rarely suggest to an author which journal to send their work to, because that's kind of making presumptions about another journal that I don't have any, you know, role in. So I will certainly guide authors to the style of journal that I think is relevant. And I, in some instances, will give quite a lot of pointers, or I'll ask an action editor to give quite a lot of pointers to an author who is clearly needing some guidance, even on research design and things like that. But it's, you know, there's a point where you can only do so much. And in many ways, if you think about it, it is our responsibility as authors and as supervisors to have the work as complete and as polished as possible. It's not really the editor's job to be polishing it for you or to be telling you where you should have sent it. But having said that, I guide people, particularly when I can tell that they might be a first author or a student. When I see in a manuscript coming in that's a sole author, I really encourage, and it's really missing the mark, I really encourage people to find a peer, find a senior experienced collaborator or colleague, because it's really difficult. The first manuscript, to try and publish that on your own, that's really, really, really hard. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Great to hear from you. And now I've got some other, let me just, I've lost my, I'm just going to go, I can see what I've done. Sorry, I'm just going back to the chat. Thanks for jumping in, everyone. This is really great. Nice conversations, who have made suggestions based on conference presentations. And, you know, sometimes the editors are sitting in the audience, folks. So, you know, have a look at the editors and what they look like before you go to the conference, and ask, you know, don't be shy, and ask your supervisor who you might talk to as well. Based on aims and scope of the journals, great suggestion, Sonia. Thank you. Considering other similar studies, yep, previously published. Sonia, that's exactly spot on. And I'm astonished when I receive manuscripts at Music Perception and the reference list doesn't cite one article in Music Perception. Like it's such an obvious thing to suggest, but people don't necessarily think about it. So who are you citing? And you're turning it around to, you know, other similar studies previously published. So you're saying something similar. Thanks, Sonia. Relevance of topic to the journal. Yes, Nicola, exactly right. If similar papers or type of research have been published in that journal, great, Scott, thank you. Appreciate you jumping in with that. So, yeah, you know all the answers, folks. So apologies if I'm really talking to the converted today. I'll just go to some suggestions I had. So the first question, I think, for us working in music psychology, what are you doing? Are you wanting to communicate with music psychologists, or are you wanting to communicate with cognitive psychologists, or are you wanting to work with musicologists? That's a really important question to ask. And as a student, I tried, and even as a postdoc, I tried hard to have a disciplinary base while I was working in an area that was looking at the perception of music. My training was psychology. I wanted to be recognized by the discipline of psychology. I was an amateur musician, but I knew that I wouldn't get a position in a school of music. So I tried very hard to keep my discipline base while doing interdisciplinary work. And I made, as a postdoc and young early career researcher, I made a deliberate effort to, wherever I could, I would send my work to mainstream psychology journals, because that world was so much bigger. And I had it was in those days possibly a little bit more competitive. And I would start to have a track record that my discipline would recognize. And perhaps it could also increase the citation rate of my papers. And then for other papers, I would pursue much more specialist journals. But I was really pragmatic and strategic about, I want to see if I can crack that mainstream psychology world. And fortunately, you know, have had positions in psychology while doing this interdisciplinary work into music and dance and other areas. But I would never call myself a musician or a dance scholar or a human machine interaction scholar. It's psychology. So think about your long-term plan and talk about that with your supervisor as well. Are you looking to publish one study or multiple? So what are, you know, some of those journals, some of those mainstream journals now, they're let's say experiment papers. So you don't try and get a single experiment published in a journal where every paper you look at has 4 and 5 experiments in it. Get a feel for what the journal is looking for. Obviously, you look to the methods that you're using and what the journal is tending to publish. And of course, the question that people are, or the comment that people are coming up with, who do you want to tell? Who's your audience? And we've already touched on the reference list. And again, really obvious, read some recent issues and make sure you feel like that's the intellectual home for your work. You want to be mindful of the fees that might be associated with it. And I guess I often say to, students, let's be researchers in everything we do, not just in the our PhD, but research the journal. So really get a feel for the journal by looking at the aims and scope, by looking at recent issues and so on. And I've got a question here. Thanks, Scott. What if your work crosses over between them, multidisciplinary, and so focus on larger market at first and then can focus later in postdoc? Well, it was a long time ago, Scott, so I'm a bit of a dinosaur now, not necessarily
I think you probably
the
answered
best
that.
role model.
Yeah, I think, because I'm thinking the same, crossing over with it's psychology, musicology, but I think, like you sort of said, you're probably better off early to get out to the larger market, the larger audience in the psych stuff, and then focus later with the more niche stuff once you've got some publications anyway. Yeah.
Good on you, Scott. And if you really planning for that academic career, that would make sense. Of course, so many of our graduates would be going into non-academic pathways now as well. But yes, the academic world was, I wanted to belong. I wanted to know who my peers were, and I wanted to feel like they were reading my work and citing it and respecting it. I think the push for interdisciplinary work is there in everything at the moment. It's funny how the world of publishing is still a little bit siloed. Granting bodies are still a bit siloed. Universities are a bit siloed. We have these departments and schools. So it's interdisciplinary on the one hand, but you're exactly right. You don't ever want to fall between the cracks, and you got to belong somewhere. You don't want the music people saying you're not a musician and the psychology people saying you're not a psychologist. And I've seen that happen. So interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work, there are such journals, and you'd be looking for those when you want to be hitting that mark as well. Sometimes it will depend on the kind of work that you've done, and even just the grunt of it in some ways, the intellectual grunt of it, Scott. So is it 5 years of work, or is it something you've run with a group of students and collected data that way? That might also guide you on what's a realistic kind of market for your audience, for your manuscript. Okay, Scott. All good. So thank you. Great suggestions there. And I reckon you're pretty knowledgeable. And so I'm going to whiz over this next bit quickly, but I guess I just wanted to make the point about researching the journals. So let me just show you a couple of journals that I was brushing up on before we joined today. So, wow, there's a lot of journals now. Okay, there really are a lot of journals. I think that's actually putting pressure on reviewers. I know. It's putting pressure on reviewers. We are all just getting so many requests to review. Yeah, that can delay things. It can mean people might be a bit cranky or are turning down the opportunity to review. So it's a bit of an issue, I think, that with so many journals. But I've just pulled together those that I would think of as music psychology journals, and just emphasizing this part of the journal that's so incredibly important, the aims and scope. So you've looked at your reference list, you've looked at a couple of issues, but read this part of the journal. Every journal has aims and scope. And even in our music psychology journals, there's subtle nuances, there's differences between them. So look at Psychology of Music. It's welcoming studies that apply social, developmental, attitudinal, therapeutic studies, listening, performing, creating, memorizing. So I think music perception does that as well. Interface between music psychology and music education. So the society, SEMPRE, behind Psychology of Music, is as interested in music ed as it is in psychology. This distinguishes this journal from music perception right off, because it's got a particular society behind it. And look at this little clause down here. Special emphasis is placed on studies carried out in Naturalistic settings, who knew? I didn't know that until I read it this morning. And the interface between psych and music education. I see a lot of papers coming into music perception that are music education papers. They deserve a music education audience. They come into the wrong journal. And naturalistic ecological settings, let's go for it. Psych of music is actually welcoming those. So that's good to know. Here's the page from Music Perception, and it's got a very brief account of what the journal is about. You can see some recent issues, but it's behind a paywall for the reasons I said. So go and find Sarah Creel's website and find that paper on her website. I bet it's there. It's just not free from the journal. And there's also a longer aims and scope from this journal when you look at the about list here. You might look at the editorial board too and see if you know anyone, see if there's anyone in Australia, see if there's someone you could have a quick chat to about the journal. Music and Science, a newer journal published by Sage, not yet having an impact factor, I don't think. Look at this. Encouraged to publish a summary of their research in audio, visual or podcast form alongside their submission for a non-specialist audience. Okay, so different again, subtle differences between the journals. This one, the society behind this one is ESCOM, so it's a European society behind Music ISCNTI, and it's very general. It's welcoming musicology, but empirical musicology. I think they have a stats policy, and look at all the areas that they'll welcome as consideration in that journal. Impact factor for the recent year and 5-year impact factor there as well. Psychomusicology, a very long-standing journal, just like Psych of Music. Mark Schmuckler, based in Canada. I always think of this as a North American kind of a journal. It's an APA, so American Psychological Association publication. And look at what they're welcoming: commentaries on trends in the field, letters to the editor, translations into English of significant papers otherwise unavailable. Probably wouldn't do that in music perception. Descriptions of training programs, and might even include titles and abstracts of recent theses. They're interested in methodology and instrumentation. Not every journal is. So each of these is really quite different. Frontiers, not a lot to say about that other than you'll be familiar with it. It's a juggernaut in publishing at the moment. It is open access and you're paying for that. There's a Frontiers with an emphasis on auditory cognitive neuroscience. There's one in performance science. And notice that's not just performance in the arts sense, but it'll pick up performance in health kinds of contexts and sports and other domains, not only music, but anything to do with performance activities and experiences. Okay, so a different frame again there. Getting a little bit more descriptive perhaps, and musicology coming in here. This EMR was right from the start an open access journal, very principled. It doesn't cost anything to my knowledge to publish there. And it has this really lovely dialogue feel to it, in that they like to set up a debate between scholars, and so there can be some commentaries on papers that appear in Empirical Musicology Review. But you know, it's empirical and it's musicology. It's different again from some of the other ones we've looked at. And then just these last couple really getting into music education. Okay, it's about teaching and learning. It's about pedagogy, quite different from the kinds of things that we'd be seeing in music perception. And of course, there would also be a raft of journals picking up on the therapy side of things. So Journal of Music Therapy, British Journal, there would be others, just as there would be other education journals as well. Okay, so that's just the aims and scope, the nuance of journals. You think they're all the same, they're really not. But let me just take a breath and see if anyone wants to challenge any of that. Really interested in opposition or any other views or suggestions. So that's the aims and scope. Pretty important, pretty obvious, isn't it? So again, apologies if I'm really telling you stuff you already knew. Okay, let's move on and I'll just do that again. I'm sure. So again, if you've been through this process, you know it. And here comes the same theme that I've mentioned a couple of times, and I would call it the pre-submission review. I didn't know about this until I took my first study leave as an early career researcher. And I went to some music labs in Canada and North America. I went to Ohio State, met Mari Rice Jones and David Huron, Caroline Palmer at that time at OSU. I went up to Queens and met Lola Cuddy. I met Laurel Trainer at McMaster. I met Sandra Treehub, Vale Sandra. I met Sandra at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Glenn Schellenberg. And they told me, well, you don't just send your manuscript off, Kate. You just get people to read it before you send it off to the journal. I had no idea about that. I guess I shared it with my supervisor. But this changed my publishing trajectory. It is a pre-submission review. And again, this is why I'm such a dinosaur. I'm probably telling you everything you already know. You've got to have a bit of spine to be able to do this, because people will give you feedback, and you're going to really ask for honest feedback, and you're going to send it to people who are reviewers. But it is such a bonus to get that kind of pre-submission review before you send it to the journal. And when I really see an unpolished manuscript, a manuscript that's almost looking for feedback, it tells me that that person hasn't gone through that process, and it's a little bit insulting in a way that they're sending it to me to give them feedback. Well, actually, we could do some of that in our own department and in our own school before sending it to the journal and necessarily taking the editors and the action editors' time. Okay, so really obvious thing. When I was first at Western Sydney, again, as an early career researcher, I would bring my students together and we started a little journal club, and we'd start to read each other's manuscripts and our chapters. We started to learn how to give respectful feedback, how to start to review each other's papers. I probably had 2 or 3 students, and it grew and grew. And but even starting with 1 or 2 students gets you thinking about research, but gets you in this spirit of giving feedback and receiving feedback. Sometimes I think there are times perhaps where there's a critical period, isn't there? When you come out of your PhD, there's a critical period of postdoctoral years. Not everyone gets out of their postdoctoral years. They might have been an academic for 20 years, and in some ways they're still postdoctoral. And I think some of that's got to do with having the confidence to share your work and receive the criticism. And we grow from that. We learn, and we're better scholars as a result of that. So labouring that point a bit, but yeah, you want to leave your postdoctoral years at some point and be a mid-career researcher, early to mid-career researcher. Draft a cover letter. Most journals will ask for this. It might be in the online upload form, but again, be aware some journals will ask you for key messages, and again, share this with your co-authors or your supervisors. Look at your keywords. That's often what I look at with music perception, and I can see they're really not aligning with what the journal's about. So look at your keywords and make sure it is working with the journal you've got in mind. You will be asked to suggest a couple of reviewers. You might think of people, you might have met them at conferences and they said to you what a great paper that was and encouraged you to publish it. You'd also want to have that conversation with your co-authors and your supervisors. Okay, so again, I reckon you're all very experienced and you know all of this, but just some suggestions of what to anticipate once you get into that point of uploading. Amanda, questions on cover letters. What do you like to see in them in terms of content? When they're optional, do you still recommend submitting one? Yeah, I've asked other editors this, Amanda, great question. The content, those key messages, it's quite a good discipline to write 4 bullet points about why the journal should care. What's the innovation? What's the new knowledge? What's the discovery? What's the thing that really makes it worthwhile for everyone to invest the time and to invest in publishing this work. So that's a good discipline. You might like to think about either bullet points of those key messages in a cover letter. People will often tell me that the work has been cleared by the Human Research Ethics Committee. So that's the kind of information you'll indicate that your co-authors have all agreed, because you're probably doing all the work as the corresponding author. You will tell me that it's not under consideration anywhere else and it's not being published anywhere else. So you might want to say that in your letter. And if it's not available on the portal to suggest to reviewers, I would put that in the cover letter as well. It's usually on the portal these days, but in the old days, I used to put it in the letter, and I'd have the person's name, Amanda Krause, the affiliation, the email, and a couple of words about why I've suggested her, because she's an expert in music cognition and social cognition and music, something like that. Okay, so 4 columns in a table of the experts. What else, Amanda? Anything else you suggest, or anyone else online want to suggest what goes in the cover letter? Okay, so what have we touched on? Ethics. The authors are all on board. It's not published elsewhere. It's not under consideration elsewhere. So you send your paper off one at a time, right? You send it to a journal and you don't send it anywhere else until you've heard back from that journal. Sometimes people tell me that it's being published as a conference proceedings. So of course we shouldn't be republishing something. So you would be telling me that it's appeared in a conference proceedings, and you're going to be telling me how it's different from that conference proceedings, and you're going to be telling me that you own the copyright, not the conference proceedings authors. All of those things spring to mind. And probably the most important letter that we're not talking about, because I'm talking about the first stage, but of course, let's imagine you've had the happy situation that it's come back asking for some revisions. The most important letter that you're sending in with that resubmission is a point-by-point response to each of the comments in the editor and the reviewer's set of commentary. Okay, so of course the letter that goes back as the author's response is a point-by-point. You don't just mark up the file and send the track changes document. You're referring to every question that's been asked. Scott is asking information on copyright. Yes. Does author not always keep this if it is published? Yes, correct. Always good to look at that, Scott. And as you get your paper accepted and the publisher sends you your agreement, you're going to look very carefully at that copyright and whether you want to make any change to the ownership of that. It's often the journal that is owning the copyright, so you would want to check that. Again, ask your colleagues, and if you're really concerned, you'd go to the legal part of your university, but usually one of your colleagues can give you a bit of advice. I've got a colleague in MARCS here at Western who often changes. They often make a change to the agreement. I don't think it ever comes, I think it's always accepted by the publisher, but they do actually make a change to it so that they have right to the copy. Someone just wrote to me, I think I can say this, at the journal about some stimulus material where they didn't necessarily have permission to use it. Really good of them to ask that. Really good of them to ask that, and that puts the journal in a very awkward position. If you're using public domain material, or not public domain, if you're using material that is copyright, of course it's on the author's shoulders to get permissions to use that. So that also might be something, if it's particularly sensitive, Scott, that you might want to include. That's obviously where the copyright is held elsewhere. So let's look at the flow chart. This is a clunky little diagram, but it's something we used right at the beginning of music perception going on to Scholar One. So I had the joy of, an absolute privilege of taking over from Lola Cuddy as editor-in-chief, but Lola had been editor for 16 years and papers were still coming in by email. So we moved on to Manuscript Central, onto Scholar One, and this was the flow chart that we set up. And it's pretty much a flow chart for most journals. The paper comes in, and this is the book review path, so we won't look at that. But ultimately, at Music Perception, I receive the manuscript, or my editorial assistant, Dr. Karen Hutchings, receives it. We look at it and make some decisions right at that beginning point, about the fit for the journal, about the word length, about whether all the permissions are in place and so on. Most often, I then, this is me, okay, and Karen and I have checked this and it's gone through to the next stage. So I've read it, and forget this, I'm now going down here. I'm now going to invite one of my associate editors to be the action editor for the manuscript. Okay, so I've read it. I know that it's fitting the journal, and it is polished enough that it can go out for review. Sometimes I ask an action editor to give me some advice if I'm not sure. We call this pre-screening. And that's often, you know, the instance of someone's a sole author. It's clearly their first manuscript ever. It's really not missing the mark. But I might get a little bit of feedback from the action editor, and then we'd send it back to the author. And in fact, that would be called a desk reject. Okay, so it comes to me, I'll send it to the action editor. They say, I don't think this is going to survive the review process. It's just not up to the mark, or no, Kate, it really doesn't fit the aims and scope. We construct some feedback, and then that becomes an immediate decision where the editor writes straight back with those comments to the author, respectfully, and often giving some pointers about what they need to do to get it into submittable form, or to send it off perhaps to a different kind of journal. And I often say, look in your reference list, because that's usually a good pointer to the journal that it should be going to. But let's imagine this one's really lovely. It's Amanda, I think you were the first author submitting to Music Perception through the Scholar One portal, I recall. And so happy days for Amanda. It was a great manuscript, went out to the action editor, who then picks reviewers and selects some reviewers from our database. We also look at those that you suggested. The action editor invites the reviewer. They then get assigned if they accept, and then a couple of weeks pass while the reviewer does their work. The review comes in, the action editor reviews, considers all of the reviews. So at Music Perception, we have at least 2 reviews, often 3. The action editor reads all of those. They're the arbiter, and they make a recommendation to me, and I'm ultimately the arbiter, but I'm taking their recommendation, and sometimes we'll have a little chat back and forth about the advice. So is the advice accept if it's probably been through revision before, or is it major revision, or is it minor revision, or is it reject? Okay, and just to talk again about Music Perception specifically, this is our acceptance rate. Now, that's not because we're only 70%, or almost 70% are rejected because they're not up to scratch. Many of those 70% don't fit the journal. All right, so the acceptance rate is relatively low. Takes us about a month for a review, and between the action editor and me getting things moving, it takes another month. So it's about 2 months or so. The average days, the system tells me at the moment, from submission to first decision is 49 days. So this all takes time, right? Because we've got to find the reviewers who accept the invitation. They need to take some time. They're busy as well. They often need an extension. The AE needs to take some time, and then I try and do it as quickly as I can, usually on a Sunday morning. Okay, so that's the steps in the process.
Kate, I'm just looking at the time. We've got about 5 minutes left.
That's all good. Amanda, so I'm going to stop again and just ask if there's any other questions, and then we'll wrap up because I'm almost there. Any other comments or suggestions on what we just talked about? The process, questions are good because you've obviously had experience. So desk reject happens for various reasons. I have rarely seen a manuscript get accepted in one go. I can think about one person who's been very close to that, but there's usually something. So major revision would be the most common recommendation, and minor revision occasionally. I try to manage how many times the things go back out for review. You know, that revision needs to really address the commentary. And if the authors are not doing that thoroughly, reviewers get annoyed, and I will put a limit on how many times we see that manuscript. It's up to us to make it, you know, communicated clearly. And if you've had a set of comments there, you do need to address them in some way. Even if you're disagreeing with them, enter into a conversation about them. Don't just ignore them. So I try not to go to, you know, we'll often have a major revision and then maybe a minor revision, but I really don't want it to go out any more than that. And ideally, I'd like to see the action editor being able to look at the major revision. It goes back, and ideally they make a decision. So really trying to keep the process streamlined. Okay, so a little bit more there about once you're over that first hurdle, what the process is. Common mistakes, Sonia. Yeah, so the aims and scope, the mismatch. Let's go to that. I happen to have a slide, and this is my last slide. I promise, folks. So let me go to share the last slide on some common problems that I see, and it is missing the mark, Sonia. It's not aligning with the aims and scope. You know, music perception, guess what? It's about the perception of music. It's kind of a bit like Pride and Prejudice is about Pride and Prejudice, but it really is about the perception of music. It's not about music therapy, for example. If there was a music therapy aspect to it, it really needs to pick up on the mechanisms of perception as well. This one, people looking for feedback, Sonia, that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes I see a literature review that is really light on, so there's not much theoretical driver or motivator for the work. And you can also see that when the discussion is just restating the results and there's no attempt to integrate with the theory from the beginning that was introduced in that literature review, and it's just restating the results rather than explaining, you know, causal kinds of explanations and interpreting the results. Small sample sizes, very common, of course, with COVID. Low statistical power. Sometimes these are pilot studies, colleagues. You know, we can't publish everything, and we do need a set of data that are reliable from an ethical and integrity point of view. We need to be able to draw firm conclusions. So small sample sizes can be problematic. Sometimes, Sonia, the research design might be a new author, a student, hasn't had much input from anyone, and sometimes the research design has some flaws in it. Flaws are hard to fix, right? A review process won't fix a confound. So sometimes that happens. And occasionally I'm seeing papers come in that are computational models. So people are doing something with big data for music perception. They don't cite the psychology literature at all. So it's a really nice model, computational model from a music information retrieval point of view, for example. Or maybe it's doing some analysis of harmony or timbre or something, but they've just not connected with perception and cognition and psychology literature at all. Okay, so I hope you've got some top tips from that. I love being editor. I love the reviewing process. I think I just always feel so privileged to have my work reviewed, and I could see as a student my work getting better and better by collaboration, but also by the intellectual generosity of reviewers and editors. The work was always better when I engaged with the reviews, and you know, people had really taken the time to help me communicate my work and make the work much more significant. So I love that generosity of the Academy, and that's why I'm an editor. I love to be part of that process. It's an incredible privilege, and I can't tell you how happy I am when I write to an author and say, accept. We really do want papers to be accepted. We want great research, really exciting findings, whether it's HAS or STEM. We really do want that. And if you talk to your reviewers and editors, I think they'll all say the same thing. I get so disappointed when I have to say, you still haven't, addressed these comments, or I'm sorry, we can't go through another round of reviews. I'm disappointed. I love accepting the work. So polishing and really thinking of your audience and the journal will help. I hope you've got some top tips. Write them down if you've maybe hopefully got 1 or 2 out of the top tips out of today, and maybe share them with your colleagues and check them with your peers. There's so much expertise with your own supervisors. Please talk to them about this, and don't be scared. Give it a go, but do that pre-review submission thing, a pre-submission review. It'll help a lot. That's everything from me, Amanda. Thank you.
Kate, thank you so much. We appreciate all that you give to AMPS, especially today's session, and I've learned some new tips, so I think we all have. So if everybody can just join me in a virtual round of applause for Kate. Thank you so much for taking the time to share tips. Publishing is clearly something that we're all keen to be doing, and I think we can really take something away from this to assist in revising and getting to that acceptance stage.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for organising, and lovely to meet you all and hear you tuning in from so many different places. Hi, Crystal, didn't say hello to you, and thanks. Good luck, everyone. If I can help, give me a ring. I'm dreadful at email, but you're very welcome to ring me up if you've got questions and I can help you. Very happy to help. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.